uh, let me introduce our great friend, Ricardo Madeira, a professor at the Department of Economics of the Universidade de São Paulo. Um, I first met Ricardo. I was trying to think when exactly, but I think it was 2009 when I came to Brazil, and I was invited to give a talk at USP School of Education, and Ricardo, uh, I don't remember, he either gave a talk or was commenting, I don't remember what it was. Neither of us were terribly well received, but at that time, in the Faculdade de Educação, but I think things have gotten a little bit better. But in any case, since that time, um, he has joined. First of all, he's uh, made a lot of very interesting research, and has joined a group of in Brazil. I would say has a group of really great economists of education who are doing very, very interesting research. It's probably one of the countries of the world. Uh, I mean, developing countries of the world. I mean, even countries of the world that has uh, many people working on the economics of education. So today he's going to talk about, um, I think, the relationship between education and the labor market, and the role of race in Brazil. So go ahead, Ricardo. Thank you very much, by the way, for joining us. It's really a great honor to have you.
Thank you so much, Martin, for the kind introduction. You are right. That was the time that we first met each other. And it's still, I mean, it's not so hard today to talk to the education school, but still hard. I mean, they still are very resistant to economists. So, yeah, it's a pleasure to talk to you guys. It's always a pleasure. So, this was like a combination. So, when Martin invited me to do this talk, he asked me to talk about my agenda on racial inequality. So, I have like different pieces on racial inequality. And here, what I'm going to try to do is to tell a story that put together all the findings of these different pieces, right? So this comes from book chapters, papers, working papers, more like a work in progress. And I try to put everything together to tell a story to you guys about how labor markets, how discrimination in the labor market or differentials in the labor market are connected to discrimination in education. Then we are going to do like a deep dive in racial inequality in the K-12 system to try to understand what's going on there that can explain the education inequality, the huge education inequality that we observe there. So the outline for today. So first, I'm going to show that labor market racial inequalities are linked to K-12 education inequality. We're going to bring some evidence on that. Then, as I said, we're going to do like a deep dive in racial inequality within the K-12 system. So we are going to bring some data on inequality in school progression, inequality in test scores, then inequality in teachers' behavior. So we're going to talk about racial stigma. We have a paper on that. Then we're going to talk about some new results that we have in racial inequality in socio-emotional skills and how they might be connected to teachers' behavior. And then we are going to talk also about parental investments and differences in parental investments as well. And then we're going to do some conjectures about policy implications and bring some data to motivate the discussion about colorblind policies and affirmative action policies. So that's the plan for today. Uh, Let me just like put my time here. So okay. So as you know, Brazil is one of the most unequal countries in the world. We rank 48 in a Gini index rank of 158 countries. So we are really doing very bad in terms of economic inequality. our social and economic mobility is very low. So there is this study of United Nations that put Brazil out of 29 countries that they were able to measure the income mobility. Brazil is ranking 27. So we are very unequal and our social mobility is very low. And Brazil, for a long time, we have these things differently from other countries where we observe incredible differences in races, in outcomes, in labor market outcomes, welfare outcomes in general between blacks and whites. In Brazil, for a long time, we have this feeling that because of our larger rates of mixation between races, we don't have like racism or any sort of important problem related to racial inequality. All right. However, we do observe like differences, very important difference between blacks and race in several areas, in several markets. So labor market outcomes are very different between blacks and whites. Health outcomes are also very different in blacks and whites in different measures of health outcomes. The same for crime and violence. So today, with the with the pandemic and with the differential effect of the pandemic across blacks and whites, uh, it has increased the social awareness about Brazilian racial and social inequality. So the term structural racism and inequality become very popular and very common in the big press and in the social media. And of course, that this is very welcoming, right? Because awareness, social awareness is something very important for our politicians to start doing something about it. So that's very, very welcome. However, when you talk about structural racism, it's very hard to think about specific policies to fight inequality because, as you know, structural racism is about a very complex discriminatory mechanisms that end up perpetuating racial inequalities. And they have like all sorts of mechanisms that are at play. So you have like social and individual mechanisms, you have formal and informal mechanisms, you have some intentional and some unintended mechanisms, and also some very subtle and others that are very explicit. So if you want to think on efficient policies, really have to pin down the causes of racial inequality. You have really to pin down what are those mechanisms so we can think about policies that can attenuate these mechanisms. So in terms of so what can you say about like immediate cause of racial inequality in Brazil to fight them? So what we're going to do here is to look to labor market outcomes. So first thing, this is just like data from the Brazil census, actually from PNAD, sorry, where we can follow, the population of the adult population over years. So here in the left panel, we are seeing a log of hourly wages over years. And what you can see is that the whites, their earnings are substantially higher than blacks. The same thing for no-employment rates, right? So the no-employment rates fluctuates over time, of course, because the economic cycles, but always the whites are lagging behind the blacks by a large amount. So large differences in the labor markets. So what could be behind those figures, right? So there are like two main factors that could explain racial differences in those economic outcomes. One is discrimination or prejudice against blacks in the labor market. And we have strong evidence in Brazil that that's at play. So there is like this very important paper of Rodrigo Soares and Irata published in the Journal of Development Economics in 2020 that they show very confident evidence that we have taste discrimination by employers. And then so this is one type of explanation, right? And then we have another one that blacks, they enter the labor market with less education than whites. So of course, if blacks enter in the labor markets with less education than whites, they are going to have less economic opportunities, and this is going to translate in different wages and different earnings and different performance in the labor market in the labor market. So there is this well-known paper from New and Johnson from 1925 in US, where they show that a substantial part of the wage differentials from blacks and whites in US comes from what they call pre-labor market factors, because they reach the labor market with different levels of education. So we are going to reproduce that evidence here, and we're going to show that the same thing's going on in Brazil, that a substantial part explanation for the difference between labor market outcomes between blacks and whites are coming from their inequality in education by the way that they reach the labor market. So here is educational attainment, the difference in terms of educational attainment between blacks and whites over time. So the left panel are for women, the right panel for men. So again, the whites are the dashed red lines, and the blacks are the solid blue lines. And as you can see here, there is again a huge gap in terms of education attainment. And this is just like years of education, right? We are not looking to quality. There is a slight tendency here to the gap's getting smaller, but still, I mean, it's very, very wide. And now what we do here, basically here we are reproducing the New and Johnson exercise. So these are regression coefficients. So these are actually the race coefficients for black and brown. So this is a wage equation where we're running wage against characteristics of the employers, right? So on the left hand side you have wage, actually the log of hourly wage, and the right hand side we have characteristics of the employers, of the workers. So so the blue bar is the coefficient for blacks, and the orange bar is the coefficient for brown. So the first column here, the model one, is just like raw differences between blacks and white. The omitted variable here is white, so these are just the gaps in terms of wages from black and from brown in comparison to whites, right? So the model one are just like raw differences between black and whites and brown and whites. And then what we did here, using data, administrative data from the state of São Paulo, where we can identify the name of the students, and the HISE data, which the data, as the formal data set from the Brazilian formal labor market. So all workers that are in the formal labor market can be found in the HISE data. So we use like these identifiers at the student level to merge and find these students in the labor market after they left the K-12 system, right? So then we have from the state of São Paulo, where we have standardized test scores in math and language. At the end of the K-12, so at the end of the high school, we have all these students taking standardized test scores, and then we find them in the labor market some years after. So we condition to
Ricardo, can I interrupt you? So your sample is just students who have completed K-12, is that right? Because
exactly.
There's obviously a powerful differential, a racial differential among students who don't complete K-12. So this is a very limited analysis of racial differences because many of them are not reflected in your data.
You're right. I'm just conditioning on the ones that finished the K-12. Yeah, you're right. And also, I'm conditioned on the ones that I can find the formal labor market. Right. Many of them are going to the informal labor market or they are unemployed, so I'm not finding them, right? So this is a very specific sample, but you can learn a lot from that sample. Right?
Ricardo, so this is people that finished secondary or more?
This is people that's exactly finishing secondary or more. Exactly.
So,
some of them, they finish tertiary, but I don't know which them finish or not.
You just know whether they finished secondary or more.
Exactly.
All right. So this represents what percentage of the Sao Paulo in this age group? About what percent finished K-12 or more?
I should have that information on top of my mind. I don't have.
It's probably 30%.
It's around 20 and 30%. Because then we have to do some restriction in terms of their age. So we are only looking for 26. So these are the age that they are at the labor market, right?
Right.
So when you do all these conditions and you end up like with 20%, between 20 and 30% of the formal labor market in Brazil.
You can't get a group that's to compare with them that's like 10 years older.
No, actually,
because you can't get this get the SARESP, right?
Exactly. I don't have the SARESP data for them. I have
but
to
you know it would be, but I suggest that we know that these gaps widen with age on race groups. So it wouldn't be bad to, if you don't have the SARESP, to do it without the SARESP, just to compare your model 4 with older group.
Yeah, exactly. The model 4 I could do for the older group. That's a good idea, actually. Let me just mark here. Yeah. So you guys got it. So these are like regression coefficients for blacks and browns. And then we go for uncontrolled model to a more controlled model. So what we do when we go from the model 1 to the model 5 is that we keep adding controls. And in the last model, what we are doing, we are adding the proficiency, so the proficiency scores in the last model. So what's very interesting is that about 60% of the gap reduction is explained. So there is like a 6% gap reduction that is explained by controlling for school attributes of the students, a proficiency, and also the school where this student finished the K-12, right? So this is pretty much, so what we can say is that at least, half of the gap is explained by what happened in the K-12 system. Of course, conditional to this very specific sample of students. And then what we do here is a Gelbach decomposition. So as you can see, there is like this difference between 0.05 here, and we are able to disentangle this in the different controls that we are using. So what's very interesting to see here is that 54% are coming from the school, 36% are coming from math proficiency, 16% are coming from a language, and then 20% are coming from socioeconomic status of the family at the time of these students were in the K-12 system. So this is the exercise for men, right? Then we do perform the same exercise for women. As you can see, the gap for women is a little bit larger for this specific sample. And the reduction is about 45% once we account for the controls. Yeah. And the same thing here, as you can see, that the math proficiency and the language proficiency has like a huge role. About 55% of the gap is explained by them, of the reduction in the gap is explained by them, and 30% of socioeconomic characteristics. So it's interesting to compare men and women, because what we see there is that socioeconomic conditions are more important for women than men, and proficiency, math proficiency is more important for men, and language proficiency is more important for girls, right? So it's very interesting to see this comparison among
So Ricardo, there's also a very large difference on escola. What does that mean? What is that?
This is the fixed effect for escola, the school fixed effect.
Okay, but then go back to men for a second. Yeah,
you're right.
So that effect is huge for men and tiny for women.
Exactly. It's 54% of the reduction in the gap for men comes from the school fixed effect, and about nothing is coming from. That's very interesting. You're right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Just
very, very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Hold that thought. Okay.
Okay. So.
But so Ricardo.
Yeah.
When you put in math scores, you're really, that's a surrogate for occupation. And I'm very, from the very beginning, I'm very skeptical of the idea that somehow test scores don't represent part of discrimination, because
No,
it
they
means
do.
it means how your test scores in math, you you know, black kids that finish secondary school or more are a kind of much rarer group than whites, okay, who
Yeah.
finish secondary school or more. So you got this, people who are really pushers. And now you're saying, oh, their math scores are lower, therefore that's not discrimination.
No,
I,
no, no. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that
oh, yeah, because
that's not what I'm.
in the US, it's been used that way by economists. They
No,
say,
no, no. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you know uh, that basically the difference that white and blacks they have like in math
yeah,
or in
yeah, but you're
language.
calling these pre-market factors.
Yeah,
You're
what I'm saying
calling these
here.
pre-market factors.
Yeah, what I'm saying here is that the way that they finish the K-12 has like explains 20%, sorry, 50% of the difference in the labor market. And I'm saying that proficiency in math and language is very important. But of course that they reach like the end of the K-12 with different levels of proficiency because there is another sort of discrimination that's going on at the K-12 system. Actually, that's what I'm going to talk about now. Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm just saying, okay, 50% of the difference in the labor market are coming from K-12 differences, right? So what's going on in the K-12? Because they reach the K-12 very differently. And as David has pointed, here there is like a positive selection for the blacks, right? Because many of them, as you said as well, are leaving the K-12 before reaching to the end, right? So actually, my point here is that if you want to reduce labor market discrimination, you have to be very careful and you have to be concerned about what's going on in the K-12 system because they get to the end of the K-12 system with very different outcomes, and these outcomes are very relevant for their performance in the market, in the labor market. So that's my
Uh,
argument.
well, I actually don't. Go ahead. I don't agree with this fundamental thing that you just said.
Okay, we can get back to that. I'm going over my point here about like what can explain the differences in the K-12 system now, right? But then by the end we can get back to that point.
So you could explain the differences between men and women by math scores also. I
What do you
mean,
mean?
you can women get lower wages than men, right?
Yeah, yeah,
They also get lower math scores.
yeah.
So that's a pre-market factor, right? Let's say you
No,
equalize math
true.
score. Well, wait
That's
a minute.
true.
Let's say you equalize math scores between men and women.
Yeah.
The question is whether that would raise their wages.
No, yeah,
It's
there is
unclear
something.
that.
Yeah, yeah, there is something that you are bringing here that why these differences for why we have like the importance of math scores is different between man and woman. So this is very relevant actually, right? But there are like many reasons that could explain there, right? One reason is that because of discrimination in the labor market actually they put different importance for math skills for men and women, right? Like lots of stories there that might be related actually to some sort of discrimination dynamic in the labor market. I don't know that. I don't know what's explaining that. I just read this as a stylized fact, right? So what I'm telling here, what we can tell, and that's like a fact, is that 50%, 60% of the difference in wages for that population are coming from K-12, from the K-12 difference between blacks, men, and black and white men, and 45% of that difference from the difference between black woman and white woman are coming from the K-12 differences. That's what I'm saying here.
Well,
right?
but really you should ask yourself, if you equalized all these things that you have in your thing, would this actually reduce the wage gap? Your argument is that it would.
That would reduce it. That's
That
what I'm
it
saying
would.
here.
That it would reduce it by 50%.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure you can say that.
Okay. Then
these are correlate. I mean, these are all correlates of discrimination. That's what I'm saying. In other words, if you took these things away, would you really reduce the wage gap? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand
if you randomly assign people color with the same test score.
No, I got it. What you're saying. Yeah. What I'm saying. Yeah. Yeah. I think that there is something because there is like some combination of these characteristics that might operate in a you might have some sort of dynamic or discriminatory dynamic in the labor market that the contrafactual cannot be read as the way that you are proposing.
That's right.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
It might have like some specific discriminatory dynamic in the labor market that that contrafactual is not true. I agree with you. But at least what I'm saying here is that differences in the taking in consideration all this discriminatory dynamic in the labor market, there is like very important differences in the K-12 system that contributes to difference in the labor market. But of course, that other stuff might be happening in the labor market, but that even if I solve all the K-12 differences, blacks and whites are not going to be in the same position in the labor market, or with this 15% reduction in the year gap in the labor market. Okay, so let me move forward here. Otherwise, I won't have time to finish here. So, but that's a good point. And okay, so going back to, so what I'm showing here is that differences in the K-12 are very important to explain differences in the labor market. So now we are going to do like a deep dive in the K-12 to understand education inequality there, right? So what's known about the dynamics of racial inequalities in the Brazilian education system, right? So first, we are going to look to some data on student progression, and then some data on student performance on standardized tests. So looking first to data on student progression. So this is the cohort of students that were enrolled in 2007 in the second grade. This panel here, the superior panel here is the whites progression, and and this panel here, the table 2, is the progression of the blacks, right? So this is 100. This is the 100% population of the whites, and this is the 100 population of the blacks. And this is data from the São Paulo state system, right? And so what I'd like to see is that, if the students are progressing as expected, they should follow the diagonal here, right? So when they reach, so after like these 5 years, the second grader students, they should be in the 6th grade if they progress as expected. So then you can see that there is like a very important gap here between the whites and the blacks. The whites have 80%, 81.4% of them reach the 6th grade, and only 74% of the blacks. And this is the same thing for the cohort of students that were in the 8th grade, that in 2007 were in the 8th grade. The same thing here. This is for the whites and this is for the blacks. And now we have an even larger gap here, right? Only 62% of the whites, they reach the 12th grade as expected, and only 51% of the blacks. So there is a difference of 11% between blacks and whites in terms of school progression. So what about trends in proficiency, right? So now we use the data, the standardized data and the longitudinal aspect of the data to follow the students and to understand what are the trends in terms of proficiency. So now in this picture here, what we have is three models, right? Three different models. So these are all measures in standardized test scores, in z-scores. Actually, these are all z-scores of percentage of correct answers, because not all of these exams, they are like IRT graded. So we have to use like percent of corrected answers, right? So what we find here, so the first is the raw model, where we just check the difference between blacks and whites over the K-12 system. So actually, there is actually a lag here of one in the grade. So this is grade 2, this is grade 3, and so on. This is grade 12. And the first model with the solid line is the model where we do not put any control there. We are just conditioning on black students and white students that finished the K-12 system. So the same argument that David did before holds here. We are just, there is like here a positive selection of the blacks, because as I just had showed to you, they stay along the way, they stay behind along the way. So we are just concentrated here on the blacks and on the whites that finished the K-12, and we are following them, their grades along the system. So the first, so as I was saying, the solid line is the raw differences. The line, the dashed line, is the difference when we account for socioeconomic differences. And then the last line, the gray solid line, is the line where we control for students that are in the same school. So just a pair of black and white students that are in the same school. So of course that when I add like controls, the socioeconomic controls and the school controls, there is a significant reduction in the gap. But what is surprising here is that the students, they reach the K-12 system, or at the second grade, the first grade that you can evaluate them, and they already have a difference of 0.1 standard deviation. And along the system, as they progress in the system, this difference is kept, right? So the school is not doing like a good job in reducing this inequality. Even, when we are just looking for the ones that stay in the system. So as we say, this exercise is actually favoring the blacks, because the ones that are left in the system, probably they have worse grades than the ones that stay in the system until the end. So it's very worrisome that our school system cannot actually reduce the gap that these children reach the school system. So what could explain, right, these differences? So in order to think about what could explain this difference, there are like lots of stories. We are going to tackle one specific story here. That's the story of racial stigma. So how we are doing that? Now, we have data on teachers assigned grade, and also we have grades or scores on standardized test scores. So the difference, for the purpose of our exercise, the very important difference between these two grades at the student level is that one is assigned by the teacher, and the teacher knows the students, in particular know the skin color of the student, and the other one is the standardized test, which is graded blindly, right? It's graded by a machine that doesn't know the race of the student. So we combine these two data to understand if there is some sort of discrimination, a discriminatory behavior of the teacher. So as you can see, this is like the CDF of the standardized test scores. Blacks are the dashed line. The whites are the solid line. These are the same figures for teachers' assigned grades, right? The transcripts, the grades in the transcripts. And we do this exercise only for math, right? So and we put the two curves together, right? So this is the z-score proficiency in math in the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis we have the end of the year math grade attributed by the teachers, right? So here we have the two curves. The blue curve is the curve for the whites, and the dashed curve is for the blacks. So as you can see, for any Z-score proficiency in math, there is a constant difference between the grade attribute by the teachers, between the grade attribute by the teachers among the black and white students. So, for instance, if you go here to the zero, the mean, right, of the Z-score proficiency in math, as you can see, these are students that have the same score in the standardized test score and are getting different grades from teachers. So teachers are actually giving a higher grades for the white students. So then what we do here is, this is a regression exercise. These are all point estimates for this regression exercise. When in the left-hand side, I have the grade attributed by the teacher, the grade in the transcript, the math grade attributed by the teachers. And in the right-hand side, I have the characteristics of the students, right? So first, we start with the last control model, where we have like classroom fixed effect, some child demographics information, and also performance in standardized tests. So the blue line is the race gap, is the black coefficient in the regression, and the red bar is the proficiency in math, is the coefficient of the proficiency in math. So when we start like controlling, right, for the students' characteristics, as we see the gap starting going down. So as we add family background, as we add past grade of the students, also when we add behavior traits, what happens is that the difference, as we should expect, the race difference goes down, right? And here, what we are doing, we use like IV, instrumental variable approach, to deal with the measurement error of the measurement error of the proficiency in math. So as an instrument, we use the proficient math in a previous grade. So we have like standardized tests in previous grades. So we use that as an instrument of the standardized tests in the current grade, right? So even in the most controlled model, even dealing with the measurement error, by the end, we should have like a significant difference of 0.35 between blacks and white, right? So we cannot like get rid of the significance of the race coefficient. But what's very interesting here is that when we condition on teachers that had like previous contact with teachers before, with the student before, so those are math teachers that knew the student, and those are the math teachers that are seeing the student for the first time in their life, right? So these guys know the student, and these guys doesn't, they don't know the students. So then the difference basically disappear, right? So the race coefficient for the teachers that know the students, that knew the student before, is not significant, and the coefficient for the race coefficient for the student, for the teachers that didn't know the student before, are still significant. So this is a very strong evidence of like statistical discrimination, because if teachers have like a previous contact with students, they don't use basically they don't use the information of race to attribute a grade to the student. But if the teachers are seeing the student for the first time, the race play a role in the grade that they are going to attribute to the student, right? So the way that we interpret this is a strong evidence that some sort of statistical discrimination is going on among teachers. And one thing that's very interesting, when we look to other characteristics of the students that are not great, but should not be related to the grade assigned by the teachers, the same thing going on. So these are the coefficients for these other characteristics, right? So this is the coefficient for the characteristics of gender characteristics. This is characteristics, the education of the mother, and this is some home ownership dummy, right? If the student is a homeowner or not, of the family of the student is a homeowner or not. So what's very interesting is that if the math teacher knows the student, all these coefficients are not significant, and the proficiency in math is very high. The coefficient of proficiency in math is high, is 11.69, right? When the math teacher does not know the student, the coefficient, the race coefficient is significant and higher, and the proficiency math coefficient is also smaller, and all the others coefficient of other characteristics of the student that shouldn't be related with the grade are also significant. So again, it seems that, it's another strong evidence that what's going on there is some sort of statistical discrimination. Okay, so what do we learn about that? Now, what are the consequences related to that? So one is that, tutor assessment may affect key non-cognitive aspects of the child, like, self-esteem, confidence, and motivation. And also, remember that the transcript is the only information that the student family get from the school about the student performance. So of course that parents and students, they react to that information, right? Because standardized test information is not informed to the families at the level of the student, right? The only performance information that the student family and the student get from the school is the grades assigned by the teacher. So of course they react, the investment in their strategy of human capital accumulation is based on the signal that they are getting from the school, and about it's conditional to the information that they are getting from the school. So these of course are going to affect parental investments on the children human capital accumulation, and also it's going to affect the effort that they shouldn't put in their human capital accumulation strategy. So such mechanisms could reinforce racial gaps in the accumulation of human capital. So let's look to this, if these mechanisms could be important. So the first thing that we're going to look here is, what do you know about socio-emotional skills of Black and white students, and if they are important for students' progress and students' proficiency. And then we are going to look to investments, parental investments across white and Black students. So first, looking to racial inequality, socio-emotional skills, we are looking to this sample of 7 grades and 9 grades that we collect in 2011. So when we pull together the grade, we have about 28,000 students here. 16,000 come from the 7 grades, and 11,000 come to the 9 grades. So this was a survey that we did in 2011 with these students. So these are the socio-emotional attributes that we collect data. So self-esteem, self-efficacy, self-control, agreeableness, rapport with peers, and locus of control. And as we can see in this figure, there is like a huge racial differences in all these dimensions, on these socio-emotional dimensions. So Blacks so whites and browns are outperforming Blacks in all these dimensions. In some of them, the Blacks are really lagging behind, right? These are all normalized measures, right? Z-scores measures. So it's very impressive, the difference between Blacks and whites in terms of their social emotional skills. So a very important question here is, should we care about these social emotional skills? I mean, they have any projective. So one way of answering that question is to look to the predictive power of the social emotional skills. So here in this panel, we are looking to the predictive power of social skills against test scores, right? So we are looking to their power of prediction in school progression. So remember, these are students, so we are now looking to the cohort of the 7th grade students. Data was collected in 2011, but since we have access to this administrative data, we can see, the progress, the future progress of this student after 2011, right? So the data in socio-emotional skills were collected in 2011 for the 7th graders, and then we know what happened to them in the future after 2011.
So Ricardo,
what we are,
sorry to interrupt, but the fundamental question about social emotional skills is whether we can measure them, and whether our measures are valid and reliable. So I don't want to get into that debate, but I just want to ask, how did you measure social emotional skills?
Okay, so these are all instruments that were like validated by the psychometric literature. So they are all well-known instruments that the psychology literature has validated them, that they were adapted to. So here I have like different types of instruments. They are all self-reported instruments that, that were validated by the psychometric literature, right? And I agree with you if they are important. I mean, there is this big question if they are relevant, they are not relevant, if they are measuring something that we really believe, especially because they are self-reported. So, they are the way that the students, there is not outside observers taking notes and seeing how these students, these are self-reported. So you have like all this bias related to self-reported measures. But one way of dealing with the question that you pose, if they are relevant or not, is to look to the predictive power of these measures in results that we believe that are important, right? If they have any predictive power on results that we believe that they are important, we don't know if we are measuring the stuff that we really want to measure, but at least we know that we are measuring something that's important, right? So that's what I'm going to show to you here. So here I'm just like basically I have the sample of these seventh grade students and seventh grade students in 2011, and I break down the samples by the progression of the students in the future. So I have the students that drop out, I have the students that where they were in different grades. So I break down the sample based on the future progression of these students, and then I can see here. So the lighter blue is the socio-emotional skills. The math is the middle color, blue color here, and the darker color is the reading, right? So what I can see here is that the students that lag behind, either the ones that drop out or the ones that lag behind, that they fail as they progress in school, they perform much better, but much worse in social emotional skills. The same thing for reading and math. So for this graph, what we can see here is that the predictive power of social emotional skills is very similar to test scores. So, that's a way of telling, okay, what we are measuring here seems to be relevant for their progress, right? So here is the difference. So here we break down for the different social emotional traits that we have measures from them. And as we can see, all of them have like a very important predictive power in terms of school progression. Some are more important than the others, especially self-efficacy and locks of control seems to be very, very important, but all of them are positively related with future progress of these students. So now these are regressions. So now, we are looking to, since we are able to follow these students in time. We have the seven grades, the seven graders doing standardized tests when they reach the ninth grade in math, in reading and math. And also we have the ninth grades doing standardized tests when they reach the end of the high school in the 12th grade. We have tests in reading and in math. And these are just regressions of the proficiency of these students for the seventh graders when they reach the ninth grade, and these are regressions for the ninth graders when they reach the 12th graders, using as a dependent variable the grades that the standardized grades that these students have when they get, so the seventh grades when they get to the ninth grade, and the ninth grade when they get to the 12th grades, right? As you can see, so for every regression here, we have a double, right? We have one that we add reading and math proficiency in the previous grade, and we have the regression where we don't add controls, proficiency controls for the grade that they were, right? And so what we can see here is that, you know, even when I control for past proficiency of the students, you know, all the traits, the social emotional traits seems to be very, to have like a predictive power on the grades, are correlated with the grades that these students have the features beyond, right, the proficiency that they had previously. This is true for 7 grades, for 9 grades, for reading and math for both group of students. So again, here is another Gelbach decomposition for the gap. So these are gaps in the teacher evaluation, teacher assigned grades, the same grades that we had before. So these are grades assigned by the teachers of math. So, and the first, so these 2 bars is for blacks and white, and these other 2 bars is for boys and girls. So this is the race coefficient, and this is the gender coefficient. So the lighter one is for the raw differences, and the darker one is for the control difference. So as you can see, when we add, as we should expect it, when we add controls, there is like, we can reduce the gap. The gap is still significant, but there is an important reduction for blacks, and also there is a reduction for the gaps of boy and girls, but is smaller than the reduction that we have for blacks and whites. However, when I look to the explained race gap and the explained gender gap across the different controls that we add, that we account in our regression, is very interesting. It seems that socio-emotional skills is much more relevant for the blacks than to explain the racial gap than the gender gap. Yeah, the proficient is the most relevant for both for gender and for the proficiency measured by standardized test scores is the most important variable to explain the gap, but the social emotion is still very important, especially for race and for the gap between gender is not so relevant. All the gap, all the gender gap is explained by the proficiency and not by the social emotional skills. So, you know, it seems that social emotional skills is very relevant for the for the racial gap that we observe in our system.
Ricardo, excuse me.
Yeah.
So I understand this. So this gap that you're looking at between the grades and their actual test scores?
Yeah. So these are the gaps between a teacher's grade and so this is the gaps for teacher's grade, right? So this is the raw gap, and then I start adding controls. What are the controls that I'm adding here? I'm adding socio-emotional skills, proficiency, LSP proficiency, and socioeconomic status, right?
So the proficiency means where they are on the proficiency scale.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
So
exactly.
the gap, I don't understand. The gap increases with.
No. I'm sorry. No, the gap doesn't increase. It decreases. So this is the raw, the lighter bar.
I know, but I'm just saying when you say proficiency.
Oh no, this is not like a positive coefficient. This is just the percentage of the gap that's explained by proficiency. So this is not like, yeah, this is just like this bar is just telling the size of the relevance, the percentage relevance of proficiency in the gap. So it's about 41% relevant.
So right? the teachers tend to have, in the case of race, there's a larger gap for those kids who have lower socio-emotional, have lower socio-emotional skills. Is that what it is, or it's just that the teachers tend to? You're saying that the teachers tend to grade Black kids with lower socio-emotional skills lower relative to their actual test scores. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, what I'm saying here is that the teachers actually they how can I say, they actually reward Black students that have more social emotional skills. Right. So they reward and their grades their grades, they reward the social emotional skills of the students,
or they basically penalize them less.
or they penalize them less. Could be,
Yeah,
because this is just relative, just to guess,
just
right?
because they are penalizing them, right?
Yeah, could be that they are penalizing exactly less. Could
Right.
be, right? Actually, that could come from discriminatory behavior from teachers, if you want.
Right.
Right? But but the important thing here is that the discriminatory behavior is measured by the social emotional skills, right?
Yeah.
It's
So the kid
captured by.
so if you're black, it really makes a difference. It makes less difference if you're white, how you present yourself and how you behave, than it is if you're black, right? If you're a black kid who doesn't have much self-esteem, your grade is going to suffer relative to your actual proficiency, right?
Exactly, exactly. That's correct. That's perfectly correct. Yeah. So we have the same thing for math. So this was the exercise. I thought that this was the exercise for math, but this was for language, the one that I shown for you first. The second is for math, but the pattern is the same, right? So it's social emotional seems to be very important for racial gap, and social emotional is not very important for gender gap, right? So this is Marcos Rangel work that's listed in that, in the pieces that I'm talking here. And here, what he looks is to parental differences in parental investment in mixed skin color children. So he takes advantage of something that's very particular of Brazil. That's the mixogenation in marriage, right? So as you can see here by this table, so this is the male head skin color. This is the female head skin color. This is all based on the census of 1991, right? So this is old data. And as you can see, there is like a significant amount of mixogenation across skin colors in Brazil. So 50% of the males that are white are married with females that are brown, and so uh, 40%, so 32% of the males that are black are married with females that are brown. So what's interesting here is that all these off-diagonal coefficients or statistics are far different from zero. So that shows that there is a lot of mixogenations here. So what's interesting about this mixogenation is that, mixed families are going to, they have the possibility of producing offsprings that have different skin colors as well. So here we are just looking to the brothers, to the ship composition of these mixed families, and as you can see, there is a significant amount of brothers that have different skin colors. All right. So we are going to. So basically, what he does is he exploit the fact that you have like these brothers, these ship compositions with different skin colors, to try to understand if within family there is like a different investment in education between offsprings of different colors, right? So that's the exercise that he's doing here. So I'm not going into the details of that, but there is something that's very, very interesting that he finds a very important results, even when you include fixed family fixed effects. You find significant differences in terms of school enrollment, preschool and school enrollment across siblings that are black and white. So these coefficients here are within family with fixed effect within family, looking to brothers that are white, and so offsprings that are white and non-white, right? And he finds a very relevant difference and significant difference between in school enrollment. And then what's very interesting that you find this for white versus mulatto, or white versus brown, but you don't find that for brown versus black. So you find significant difference between white and black, but you don't, and white and mulatto, but you don't find a significant difference between mulattoes and black. So the very important findings that he got is that, you know, the white children, so basically the chances of a middle school conclusion for the white brother, so the white kids are 70.5% more likely to finish the middle school. When we condition on only the men comparing brothers, the difference is 12.5%, and when we condition on sister, the difference 2.80%. So the same thing holds for high school conclusion, right? So when you look to different outcomes across these kids, looking for health outcomes, when we look to health outcomes instead of looking to instead of looking to school outcomes, what do we that we don't find any difference there? So there is like a suggestion when, you know, when you look to the data, it seems that, you know, parents are actually adjusting their human capital investment to differential in expected returns among blacks and whites, right? So parents are actually anticipating that school returns for blacks and whites are different, and they adjust their investment. It's also very interesting that, you know, when you look to the paper, that he also looked to the data when these brothers, you know, when these ships are they are actually adults, and what he finds that the the whiter brothers are more likely to host the black brother when they are actually older. So it seems that there is some sort of compensation within family. So it's a very interesting result that shows that there is some also differences in parental investment, even when these kids are in the same family. So with this evidence
So
in
Ricardo,
mind,
Ricardo, if this is true, they're really not maximizing on rate of return because they don't know that. They're just maximizing on return.
they are actually maximizing the expected return that they imagine based on their belief, right?
But not rate of return, because
Oh yeah, it's not the, yeah, it's just the, you know, the expected return,
right,
it's not the rate of return, it's just the
expected income.
Exactly. Okay, with this evidence in mind, what can we say about policies to fight racial inequality, right? So first, we are going to talk a little bit about colorblind policies to deal with racial stigma. You know? So again, I mean, if you buy that our evidence is a evidence of racial stigma or statistical discrimination, and then you know, one important thing is to improve the knowledge of teachers about their students, right? Because it seems that, you know, we show that when the teachers, they know the students, there is no discriminatory behavior. So it seems that the mechanism that's operating there is like some sort of asymmetrical information, right? So it's important to, you know, improve the knowledge that teachers have about the students. So one thing that we should be doing is that's related with other stuff that also is related with other positive results for education is to reduce the teachers turnover. You know, teachers if they stay more time at school, they should know better at the same school. They should know better the students, and so we should expect that less racial stigma. Also, it's very important that teachers, you know, they should have contact with real schools and student their initial training. So this calls for some practical training through internship programs when they are in their initial training, some sort of pedagogical residency. So how to improve teachers' awareness about racial stigma? So training on how to evaluate students is very important. So something that we know in Brazil, I have other research that have showed that teachers, they don't know exactly how to evaluate students. They don't have good criteria to evaluate students. They know how to build good tools to evaluate students. So training them on how to evaluate students more objectively is very important. Also, training, promoting social emotional skills seems to be very important, since we show that differences in social emotional skills could be behind of this racial stigma. Also, there is some recent literature that has shown that when you have this sort of informal or thorough or unintended discrimination behavior, using some sort of informational campaigns can also increase the awareness of teachers. So that should be something that we should be testing, right? And something that I believe here is that very likely teachers' value added are less related to racial stigma. So if increase teachers' quality, you should reduce racial stigma. But this is just a speculation. We don't have, robust data on that. So what about social promotion? So there is
Ricardo,
Yeah.
excuse me. Can you jump to your, we only can have 10 minutes here for questions. So are you almost at the end of this presentation?
Oh, okay. So I can actually, I just have one point to make. It's about social promotion. So let me do that point here, and then I stop.
Okay.
And so, there is this huge discussion in Brazil about social promotion when you don't fail a student from one grade to the other within a cycle of 4 or 3 grades, something like that. So what we show here is that here we are comparing the differential attrition between blacks by different promotion rules. So the dashed line is schools that have social promotion, and the solid lines are schools that do not have social promotion. So what we can see here is that the blacks, they benefit much more than, or disproportionately, than the whites of the social promotion policies. Okay, so I'm stopping here. I have like two more slides actually, and so I stop here and I wait for the questions. Thank you so much.